We went back and forth about a title for this lecture, and Steve thought end of semester, it's beautiful in Oregon, people are kind of tired of lectures and stuff. Maybe something that sounded more controversial than disaggregating evidence on Warangal district's BT cotton empirics would be of more appeal. So tonight I'm going to talk about playing God, monsters, miracles, politics of genetic engineering. It seemed in retrospect something of a bad choice because I'm not a theologian and I skate on very thin ice talking about such issues. But on the other hand, it does remind me, much of this controversy has been couched in terms of science and anti-science, or science versus Luddism, that is, people who oppose technological change. And that clearly isn't quite right, because there are no scientific answers to lots of issues about cultural preference, or about theology, or about risk construction. So we'll be talking about some of those things tonight. And so this is the title. I've now got my clicker that looks like it will click, and we can get started. So I'm thrilled to be here. It's the first time I've been in Corvallis, and it's been really a wonderful experience. I've met a lot of people. So this is the puzzles I'm going to talk about and kind of a roadmap. What does a social scientist know about either theology or genetic engineering? I carry no pretense. I am a social scientist. I do mostly kind of political economy type stuff in agriculture. Why is our species deeply divided between a monster and a miracle narrative of genetic engineering in agriculture? There is no such divide around genetic engineering in either the white technologies in industry or the red technologies in pharmaceuticals and biomedicine. There is a huge dispute in agriculture. Why is that, right? Thirdly, why do ideas have power in society? Political scientists, economists tend to talk about interest, and these interests turn out to be material. They have to do with organizations and the gaining of power. Why do ideas have power in society? And I'm going to argue that the ideas surrounding genetic engineering are foundational in understanding the politics. Okay? And then finally, how might we think through ways out of this impasse? I want to say something at the end about how we're not stuck with an impasse. There are ways to think about it. So let me start with this. What does a social scientist know about either theology or genetic engineering? All my colleagues, when I started talking about BT cotton and the Bacillus thuringiensis, and my colleagues thought I was nuts. Nobody paid any attention to what I was saying. They couldn't figure out why on earth I was interested in this in the first place. It's not what political scientists do. Let me tell you how this happened, because it's kind of an illustrative story. I work in the southwest corner of India, Kerala state. This is a state made famous by Amartya Sen and Al Gore, who said, look, this is one of the poorest parts of India. It has a life expectancy longer than that of blacks in the United States. It has an infant mortality rate better than Washington, D.C., which is probably not a fair comparison. That's kind of cherry picking. But on the other hand, this is a state that has achieved remarkable human development at very, very low per capita incomes. And it's a state that I study. And I do a lot of work on agrarian movements in that state and what they've done with land reform, labor reform, and credit systems and so on to make farming a viable occupation. So I was there in one of my villages where I've worked before. There was a conference celebrating a famous agrarian activist, Karelian, who had battled for decades for getting land for the landless people. And so there's a celebration of his memorial date, and I was supposed to talk, and I didn't know what to say. And I sat down with my good colleague and friend and economist, P.A. Vasudevan, and I said, Vasudevan, I don't know what to say. What are you going to talk about? And he said, the Terminator. And I said, the Terminator? And he said, yes, the threat to India farming, and to the entire third world, the Terminator technology from Monsanto. And so I said, Vasudevan, I don't want you to embarrass yourself. This is a hoax off a Canadian website. I didn't know biotechnology, but I knew the controversy surrounding Terminator technology. There's a patent by USDA and Delta and Pineland for gene use restriction technology of a particular kind. Hasn't been out of the laboratory as far as we know. It certainly hasn't been commercialized, and it certainly isn't in BT cotton, which is the only transgenic crop in India. So I said, don't embarrass yourself with this basically hoax off a website. You know? And Vasudevan said, oh, okay, Ron, I didn't quite understand this. Da, 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 da. He went on for 45 minutes about the threat to India from the Terminator technology. And indeed, the next thing I found out was that there was a new farmer organization in this district. Now, this is a district densely organized with farmers. Much of India, farmers have no power. No one pays them any respect. They have no political clout. But in this district and in Kerala state in general, farmers are extremely well organized and very powerful. In fact, the farmers in this district had 11 farmer organizations and 7 landless labor organizations just within that one district. They're competing with each other, one allied to the communists, one allied to the Congress, one allied to the socialists, and so on. So this is a state in which there is enormously high popular mobilization around agriculture and by agriculturalists, which is one of the reasons they've had effective land reforms and effective public policy for the poor. So I said, why do we need a new organization? The new organization was the Desha Karshaka Samrakshana Samiti, which, as we say in South Texas, sorry, which means the National Farmers Protection Committee. And I said, protection, why is there a need for another farmer organization? Farmers are already so busy they can't go to meetings, you know, they can't plant their fields. And the answer was to protect us from the Terminator. So this was really fascinating that this kind of narrative from a Canadian website had penetrated to this out-of-the-way place in South India. Now, Vasudevan, once he got on the podium, he talked for 45 minutes, and he said, we know how to battle the police, we know how to battle the landlords and their gundas, that is their thugs, we know how to fight the forces of reaction, we have fought them for decades and we have won. But what we have won is only the mud. This is a rice growing area. We've only won the mud. The world is controlled by the corporations. And so all of our struggles have come to nothing because we don't know how to fight globalization. And so there was an immediate marriage of a real fear that all of these popular struggles had come to nothing because the power that you have in a district or even a state in South India is nothing compared to the power of globalization. So he was really desperate to come up with some kind of scenario whereby you could fight globalization, and he had no idea how. But that was the fear, and that's why there was a farmer organization to protect farmers from the Terminator technology. So about the same time, I was fascinated by this. You know, so I swore I'm going to find out about this Terminator, why people think there is a Terminator and what's going on. They don't even grow cotton in this district, essentially, but the Terminator was supposed to be in BT cotton. So I spent a little bit of time more in the district, and while I was there, the government of India, the parliament, the government of India in New Delhi, 3,000 miles away, the parliament passed a resolution saying that Coke and Pepsi would be banned on the parliament grounds. And there was tremendous celebration in my district because everybody is opposed to Coke and Pepsi because they're multinational corporations. But the reason they banned Coke and Pepsi was the levels of insecticides. Okay? The levels of insecticides are something like between 30 and 40 times the EU limit for pesticide residues in drinks. And so the celebration was a little bit premature because that meant that all of the groundwater was saturated with pesticides. Most of the pesticides in India are used on cotton. So the question became, well, if this BT cotton has come along and says that it's going to reduce farmer use of pesticides, and we're drenching our groundwater in pesticides with truly horrific ecological and human health effects, what can be so awful about the BT cotton? And the answer is very simple. It's a GMO. Okay? So that's where my kind of standing in this debate comes from. I was shocked by the power of these ideas in a district very far away from national capitals and sort of transnational advocacy networks and so on. And I wanted to find out why these ideas had so much power and why there was so much activity around stopping the Terminator, which didn't exist, when there were so many critical things that needed to be done in rural India. There's so many critical things that collective action could address. Why do we have concentration on Terminators? Well, this is my puzzle then for the lecture. Why is there this persistent global rift on biotechnology? Given all the things that collective action could do, why are people spending time mobilizing against GMOs? What are GMOs? What do they come from? And this is one answer. This is where the playing God things comes in. Notice that this is, see up here it says updated and expanded second edition. Most academics would kill for an updated and expanded second edition. We usually don't go through one. But anyway, so this is second edition. Food apocalypse, GMOs, they are playing God and shoving it down your throat. This in particular is a biblical response to genetic engineering, but we're not going to go into that. What it does imply, though, is a deeply unnatural character of transgenic organisms, and it also implies hubris, right? Playing God means taking into your own hands the hubris, the assumption that you know enough to change nature in ways that may be fundamentally unalterable. Okay, so note too that we get this kind of satanic picture. It's a very, very nice cornstalk turned into a satanic picture. This is a kind of book that follows from the hubris theme, hubris and hybrids. And of course, this is Hard and Jameson in Danish scholars. Oops, excuse me. And the logic here is the Frankenfood phenomenon, right? That there is a monster created by science. It's out of control of everyone. Once the monster's created, it is unrecallable. It is out of our control, and that's what makes it fearful or fearsome. So hubris and hybrids, a cultural history of technology and science. The theological construction I take from Prince Charles. Prince Charles has been very, very active in the anti-GMO movement internationally and very active in India, as we'll see later. So 1998, he says that scientists were entering realms that belong to God and God alone. So genetic engineering is entering a realm that we human beings should not even enter. He also notes that there is a catastrophe that has come from GMOs spreading around the world, one of which is climate change. And this is the kind of argument he's making, catastrophe. This is a website. The authority here is an economist, professor of economics, University of Ottawa, who has been on an extraordinary number of international committees, the United Nations, the World Bank, various kinds of international committees. And he has been president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Latin America and the Caribbean and so on. So this is someone who is a reputable academic, an economist. And this is his statement. GMO seeds invariably resulting in famine. Invariably resulting in famine. Now what I want you to get is that if you buy this scenario, if this knowledge is authoritative, that this grotesque picture of a child, if this is the reality of GMOs, then there is no surprise that there is a global mobilization against GMOs. Right? So the authoritative knowledge drives the political mobilization. Well, there's obviously a counter to this kind of argument. This is Rob Perlberg's book that's Harvard University Press last year. And what Perlberg argues is that Africa has exactly the opposite problem. Not enough science, not enough investment in science, and specifically how biotechnology is being kept out of Africa. How is it being kept out? It's being kept out by transnational advocacy networks, social movements, which have deep roots in Europe, on which Africa depends both for aid and for trade. So it's the dependency of Africa as well as its cultural dependency. Read Le Monde if you're in Africa, in French-speaking Africa. It matters what happens in Le Monde, probably not what happens in USA Today. Okay, so starved for science. So this is the nature of this cognitive rift. These perspectives can't both be right. I said that earlier today and someone challenged me, but I thought about it a lot. It can't be true. It can't be true that Africa is lagging worse than any continent on the planet in terms of agriculture because of its failure to adopt modern science in agriculture, and that GMOs cause famines. Okay, so Prince Charles has an interest in India, and we'll see later on. In 2008, Prince Charles condemned the truly appalling and tragic rate of small farmer suicides in India. I blame GM crops for farmer suicides. And the question here is, why would the government of India, this is the world's largest democracy after all, why would the government of India promote technology? There is a biotechnology cell, there's official government support for biotechnology. Why would they support technology that kills farmers? What does Prince Charles know that New Delhi doesn't? And this is what Prince Charles knows. He knows from Vandana Shiva. Information flows through what I call authoritative brokers. You think about, where do we get information we trust? Especially with the internet and with the explosion of sources of information, none of us can incorporate all the possible sources of information and sort of adjudicate them. Even if we could, we don't have time. Most people don't have the kind of expertise that's required to understand what's involved in genetic engineering of a crop. So we're dependent on brokers. All of us are, including myself. So when I first was teaching at Northwestern, which was my first job, a student caught me in the library and said, "Professor Herring, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm sort of getting books just like you are." And she said, "But don't you already know everything?" I said, "Well, no, actually. I know this. I certainly do not know everything, and not even close." So we're all dependent on brokers, authoritative sources. If you read it in the New York Times, does it count more than if it comes out in USA Today or the Ithaca Journal, God forbid, where I live? Right? Okay, so Vandana Shiva says, and I think I'll read this, even though you can read it. These seeds kill biodiversity. Seeds kill biodiversity and people's freedom. For example, Monsanto's Bt cotton, which already pushed thousands of Indian farmers to debt, despair, and death. Bt cotton is based on what's been dubbed Terminator technology, which makes genetically engineered plants produce sterile seeds. That's a biocultural abomination, a seed that cannot grow. And she says Bt cotton is in that category. Terminator technology can't grow. High cost of cultivation, low returns have trapped Indian peasants in considerable debt from which they are escaping by taking their lives. More than 40,000 farmers have committed suicide, although a more accurate term would be homicide, as Monsanto is killing Indian farmers, or genocide, the destruction of an entire class of peoples. Genocide. Her current update is 60,000 farmers have committed suicide, but it keeps changing. It's always round numbers, but it keeps changing. Okay. So this is what the kerfuffle is about. This is what the entire program of genocide, homicide, suicide seeds. I mean, think about the anomaly here. The perfect dramaturgical homology between suicide seeds, that is Terminator technology, and farmer suicides. So the suicide seeds and the suicides of farmers are kind of joined in this seamless homology of language. And this is what it's all about. So this is a bollworm. This bollworm, several important things about this bollworm. He lives in Warangal district. Why am I in Warangal district? Because of all the reports of dead farmers and dead sheep and catastrophe, Warangal district is the epicenter. Right? They're highly concentrated regionally, and this is the epicenter. So 3 of us went, a team of sort of a botanist specializing in agricultural crops, a microbiologist specializing in actually a lot of recombinant DNA work, former regulator for the USDA, and myself, who kind of doesn't know any of that. Okay, so here we are in Warangal district. This picture tells us a lot. American bollworm, not because he came from America, but because he was first noticed when American cottons came to India, and he jumped on the cottons, and so he's called the American bollworm. This woman, you see the bangles on her hand, it's a woman that owns this land. She has about 1.5 acres, which makes her not a tiny holder, but a small holder, right? So that's a football field and a half. That's all her livelihood, football field and a half of cotton. She's growing this new variety. This is completely illegal. This variety comes from China. It's made in the public sector in China. It's called Fusion BT. It contains a single transgene, which causes an insecticidal protein to be expressed in all of the tissue of the plant, right? So she doesn't spray her crop for bollworms. She's showing us this bollworm, and then the question came up, well, first, why are you growing an illegal crop? And because it hadn't been approved by the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee, transgenic crops are very heavily regulated, very, very heavily regulated. So it's not approved by the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee, but lots of people in this area grow this Chinese public sector cotton because they like it. Seeds are easily movable across boundaries. And she's growing it because her neighbors grew it and they got good results, and so she wanted to try it. She's also trying 3 other illegal varieties at the same time. But, okay, that's why I don't show her face. I mean, So anyway, okay, so here's the bollworm, and I said, or I think I said, yeah, I think I was the one that said this first, you know, well, shouldn't somebody kill this bollworm? I mean, this is a devastating pest in cotton. It can destroy thousands of acres at a time. It can really destroy whole crops. Shouldn't we kill this bollworm? And she who owns the land says, no, I don't think so. It's not quite right to kill a little living being. I'm not going to kill him. And I looked to my two colleagues, and they both said, I'm not going to kill a bollworm. After all, I'm a Hindu. And I said, well, I'm a Texan. I'm into violence, but I don't feel like smashing a bollworm either. You know, there's something sort of homey about this little bollworm crawling across his leaf. And so I didn't kill the bollworm either. And then the farmer said, the woman said, if he eats my plant, he will die, because the plant itself has an insecticidal protein. She didn't say insecticidal protein. She said the plant has something in it that will kill the bollworm. If he doesn't attack my plant, he won't die. The responsibility is off my shoulders, onto the shoulder of the bollworm. It's up to him, you know. So we all escaped the moral hazard of killing this bollworm, and we let him continue on. And he's munching on the leaf, and I'm sure he's gone by now. Okay, so the suicide seeds, Vandana Shiva, remember, constructed these suicide seeds, and this is what Prince Charles worries about. This is what much of the world worries about. Suicide seeds in India, Terminator technology, farmer debts, and that sort of thing. So this is Gujarat. Gujarat's the northwestern province of India. Mahatma Gandhi came from Gujarat. Many of you know the Gujaratis because they own half the motels in the United States. The Patels are sort of a famous Gujarati clan that has lots and lots of enterprise in the United States. But Gujarat, 2001, was a horrific bollworm rampage. Horrific. And it just wiped out the bollworms. The bollworms wiped out the cotton crop throughout much of Gujarat. Now, this is Sharad Joshi. He is the president of the farmers' organization Shetkari Sanghatana. The Shetkari Sanghatana was India's largest farmer organization at the time. And this is what he said about this lucky stroke. A nondescript seed company managed to play Robin Hood and smuggle into Gujarat one line of anti-bollworm gene. For 3 years, nobody noticed the difference. And then came the massive bollworm rampage of 2001. Gujarat saw all of its traditional hybrid crop devastated side by side, the BT gene crop standing resplendent in their glorious bounty. Okay, this guy used to work for the World Bank. The government was upset and ordered destruction and burning of the bounteous crop. Right? He said this in English. This is not a translation. Okay, so he said this in English. And what does it mean? The government was upset and ordered destruction and burning of the bountiful crop. It was illegal for anyone to be growing Bt cotton until the field trials had been thoroughly vetted by the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee in Delhi. So it's as if, you know, you're trying to you're growing something in Northern California, but you haven't cleared it with Washington, D.C. It's illegal. You shouldn't be doing it. There are lots of people in, you know, Marin County and further north that sort of do grow illegal things, but they haven't cleared it with the authorities yet. Probably won't. So the government, Delhi, came in and demanded that this crop be destroyed. Right? And the way they found this out was not the social movements, and it wasn't the government of India. The way they found it out is just the sheer anomaly of, you know, a green and white patch here, a green and white patch there. Everything else is brown and dead. Green and white patch there. Monsanto PCRs the cotton, finds out it is not only the Cry1AC, but it's in their construct. This is not the Chinese construct. This is Monsanto's. And they called foul. They called the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee. The Genetic Engineering Approval Committee said to the guy who played Robin Hood, his name is D.B. Desai. He's a small firm seed operator. He was the one selling this bollworm, anti-bollworm cotton. They ordered him to come to Delhi, and so on and so forth. They came down very heavily on Mr. Desai. They ruined his business, restricted him from selling any more cotton, but that was his penalty for not obeying the law. Okay. The Indian farmers, though, mobilized quickly. And I mean, these were amazing rallies. This rally at Nilkanteshwar. Nilkanteshwar is the kind of the Shiva with the big blue throat. when he takes the poison from the world and dissolves the poison himself. And that's what, I mean, it's symbolic that they went to Nilkanteshwar, the temple at Nilkanteshwar, to protest the government taking away their BT cotton, which they saw as doing the same thing, of taking the pesticide and dissolving it from the body politic. Okay, so New Delhi ordered this seizure. At the rally, the main organizer of this rally said they'll have to walk over our corpses to destroy our crop. This is our satyagraha. Remember, Mahatma Gandhi was always having satyagrahas, force of truth. This is our satyagraha. This is a question of the farmer's freedom to select his seed and access technology. Interestingly enough, the Shetkari Sanghatana went on to say that the restrictions coming out of New Delhi on farmer technology were similar to the restrictions that sacred sayings cannot be said by lower caste people. That is, that this was urban people keeping technology for themselves, denying technology to the lower orders of society, that is, to the peasantry. So this was an explicit anti-urban and anti-upper class kind of movement that said we farmers should be able to choose our own technology. And indeed, they kind of had a point. They're saying, look, in cities, people all the time have, I mean, can you imagine in New Delhi, they have illegal DVDs and illegal pharmaceuticals, various kinds of pirated stuff, business software. Of course, it's all there. And the farmers say, why can't we have access to technology? Why is New Delhi trying to bottle this up? So New Delhi lost. Make a long story short, state of Gujarat said, no, we're not going to do this. Our farmers don't want us to do this. Delhi was humiliated. They had the commerce minister. This is like in Washington, D.C. You have the minister, we don't have the Secretary of Commerce, has to come out on a stage and say, we're not going to prosecute anybody in Gujarat because cotton is important for India's industry, and if the farmers like this technology, we're behind them, and so we're just backing off, despite the fact that this is completely illegal, and under Cartagena Protocol standards, they should not have been allowing this particular crop to be grown. The state next door, 80 million people, Maharashtra, the state next door, the farmers said, if Gujarati farmers can have this, we should have this. Legislative Assembly in Maharashtra voted immediately to allow the farmers in Maharashtra to have it. Meanwhile, in Delhi, there's an official government agency that has to approve these crops, and it basically caves in 2 months and says, okay, you can have this crop. Okay. So Delhi lost out. Operation Cremate Monsanto, which was the operation that I mentioned in passing to get Monsanto out of India and to destroy their crop, it failed completely. The rapid near universal spread of Monsanto's specific BT technology. This is insecticidal protein, only kills bollworms, and it's one that has spread almost universally in India now among hybrid cotton crops. The illicit appropriations of BT technology by farmers. Once Robin Hood was prevented from doing business, farmers started making their own BT hybrids. I asked a farmer in Gujarat about this because I'd heard these rumors, so I went to Gujarat to find out about this. I asked this farmer about it, and he said, this is not rocket science. I mean, they're just making hybrids. Right? And they've been making hybrids for a very, very long time. Excuse the Indian accent, it's kind of a Peter Sellers moment. But so we then had a kind of agrarian anarcho-capitalism around BT seeds. Farmers started getting into the act, making their own varieties. I'll show you one in a minute. This was called a cottage industry in Gujarat because it had very low startup cost. All you needed was 2 parental lines and some family labor. So a lot of families that had very little land, but a lot of labor, they started making hybrid seeds. And it was called by the people in Delhi genetic roulette. This was a terrifically dangerous thing. Nobody was regulating this explosion of BT cotton cultivars. So the new cultivars started coming out, both indigenous and foreign public sector, like Fusion from China that we've met before. By 2007, there were 137 legal hybrids with BT. This is from the government. But then there were dozens of stealth hybrids. Here's one. This is kavach, which means protection in the sense of a sword goes into a sheath. It's protection, but it's kind of more generally protection. And this is a farmer-bred variety of BT cotton. These farmer-bred transgenics, they were wonderful in terms of their marketing. Monsanto, Mahiko, their partners, they have uninspiring names for their products like Mech 162, right? These guys have names like Rakshak and Maharakshak and Agni, which means fire. Maharakshak means great protection. Agni means fire. Lakshmi means wealth. So they had fabulous names for their products, and they more or less guaranteed them locally. That is, you paid half to your local dealer, and if your crop didn't do well, you didn't pay the other half. So they had a kind of insurance scheme because nobody knew whether these local products would work very well. Okay, so this is Kavach. This is a farmer who feels aggrieved because these are F2 seeds. In this kind of audience, do we know what an F2 seed is?
No, don't assume it. No.
Don't assume nothing. Okay. If you grow cotton hybrids, right? And then you gin the cotton, you get all this cotton fiber coming out. The gin spits out all these little seeds, which are used for animal food cakes and pressed for oil. And they have various uses for cotton seeds, but they're just spit out of the gin at the end of the process. If you put transgenic hybrids into the cotton mill, you get F2s, that is second generation transgenic hybrids out of the mill. So farmers started selling these when it became more difficult to get the Robin Hood seeds. The Robin Hood seeds, Navbarat 151, farmers love these seeds. There's a huge number of studies of farmers liking these seeds a lot, but they couldn't get them. So they started doing their own hybridization or using F2s. Now this farmer is angry because F2 seeds are very cheap, but he was sold F2 seeds in an old container of Lakshmi, which means wealth, right? So he was given old seeds in, what's it, old wine in new bottles or something like that, or old new wine in old bottles. Anyway, he had F2 seeds that were sold as more expensive seeds. So here's a range of choice, just to give you a sense of what's out there. F2 seeds, these guys, these F2 seeds should cost 10 rupees a packet. This is licensed from Mahiko Monsanto, should cost 1,800 rupees per packet. This is Kavach, which I bought for about 450 rupees for the packet. Each packet plants about an acre, 450 grams. So this is a representative of the range of choice, right? So bioserfdom is one scenario, Monsanto is one scenario. All of these are real farmer choices at different price points, and farmers have chosen. So I want to introduce God again. This is Anil Gupta. Now, Anil Gupta came and told this story at Cornell. Anil Gupta is a professor of management at the Indian Institute of Management, a very prestigious place in India. And Anil came and told the story more or less parallel to the story I just told about cottage industries, regulation failing, farmers winning the battle against the state. And he called it, in the summary of his lecture, he said, I think this is probably the greatest participatory plant breeding experiment in human history. Because once the government shut down Navbarat 151, everybody was on their own and they started experimenting with different varieties. They used the male hybrid, the male parent that had the BT gene, and they crossed it with local varieties and made these new hybrids. So this is what Anil Gupta said. And I think he's right. This was a fantastic experiment in participatory plant breeding. Everybody was getting into the act. But the audience was aghast. The audience was aghast. Here you have this kind of vaguely Gandhian-looking guy. I mean, you don't have his full picture here, but he's got a long kurta, and this is khadi. It's sort of organic cotton spun in villages and all this kind of stuff. And he's a very sort of he is in fact Gandhian and very traditional. I wouldn't be surprised if he spins at night after he does his email. So to hear Anil Gupta talking about this sort of underground seed proliferation of transgenic seeds among peasants in India, people were absolutely horrified. And I remember this audience was shocked, and one student finally stood up and said, but isn't this against Indian culture? I mean, Indian culture has been presented in other parts of the world, as you probably all know, as kind of being more mystical and not very materialist and so on. It has nothing to do with India, but it's out there. And so he says, oh, no, just look at Indian culture. We have our wonderful god Ganesha. Ganesha is worshipped by everyone. What is Ganesha? Well, he's got an elephant head, and a human body, and Ganesha is much beloved. All of our gods are like this. We have hybridity among our gods, and we don't bother much about species boundaries. You know? We just don't care much about species boundaries. That's not the question, right? And I got to thinking about this, and of course he's right. The playing God scenario presupposes Garden of Eden, single maker with a plan, ark, you know, limited number of species. These species kind of get on the ark, nothing changes. But that doesn't apply in most of the world. And so here is Ganesha. We could do a bunch of these, but I love this picture of Ganesh. But we have this in our history as well. There is a long Greek tradition of hybrids and hybridity and species crossing and so on. And it runs counter to the notion of a garden, a maker with a plan, and so on. Okay, so let's get back to the real world. So let's look at India. We've now seen the playing God scenario may play very well in Acton. It doesn't play at all in India. But let's look at India in a global context. Diffusion of recombinant DNA crop technology. Everybody does know recombinant DNA. Is this a word that we're familiar with? It's sometimes called gene splicing, or the movement of a gene typically from one species into another species. Right, so this is recombinant DNA technology. The divide is often portrayed as the rich countries and the poor countries. Right? The divide is north-south. It's not at all true, right? This is a list of, this is actually out of date in several ways. There are many more countries that should be here, but there's some that shouldn't be. France has recently outlawed transgenic corn. So the divide is not north-south or regime type. I put the OECD countries in bold. These are the relatively rich countries. But if you look at the top 5 nations after the United States, it's Argentina, Brazil, Canada, India, and China in terms of acreage of transgenic crops. So this is not a north-south thing in any real sense. And this is a picture. I know Steve is probably sick of this because he's seen it 3 times today. But this is the standard story of diffusion of recombinant DNA technology in agriculture. And I want to point out several things. Oh, I better hurry, actually. Okay, point out several things. One is this moment. Europe started out on the same trajectory as the United States. This is the moment when social movements intervened, and an amazing framing, so I say ideas matter, an amazing framing was accomplished that split our DNA technologies into 2 pieces. Agriculture, that were called GMOs, and framed as risky, unnatural, dangerous, monopolized by transnational organizations, on the one hand, and then other kinds of rDNA technology like pharmaceuticals. We've had human insulin being produced by GMOs since 1978, but no one ever has arguments against human insulin. You never see a poster that says, stop the Franken pills or stop the Franken injection. It's only Franken foods, right? And there's a reason for this, okay? So the origin of this oppositional frame, in social sciences, we talk about social movements succeeding or failing based on a number of characteristics. One variable is framing. How is something framed? All new technologies need framing. That is, that we have to know what kind of meaning should we give to them. Should we code them positively or negatively? How should we think about a new technology? And if you go back in history, you'll find these fantastic battles over things like the automobile. In retrospect, the wrong side won in that, but there was tremendous opposition to the automobile on the grounds that nobody could sit on a contained explosion all day, right? And obviously here we are, and we kind of probably wish we hadn't been. But in 1973, recombinant DNA was successful as a means of making new organisms. By 1980, we had property in transgenics. It's the famous case of Chakravarti versus Diamond. This led to the anti-globalization campaigns on 2 grounds: biosafety, bioproperty. Make sure we understand both those. Biosafety says these things are unnatural because of the way in which the trait is introduced into the plant. That's an unnatural way of doing things, and it's dangerous. Secondly, the United States is attempting to export very strong property regimes. That's why I put bioproperty up here. So the notion that multinationals will control the property rights. One of the problems with that that's not frequently understood is that patents are national. So there's no patent in India on BT cotton or any other plant, right? So patents are national. You may have a patent in New York or in the United States, right? A patent in the United States, France may or may not recognize it. India may or may not recognize it. So patents are national. But the United States attempts globally to push strong property regimes. And the splitting off of the white and the red from the GMO frame means we don't worry about biosafety and bioproperty in those spheres. Whoever complains that pharmaceuticals are controlled by really large multinationals? You go to your doctor and he says, I want you to take this pill. What do you do? Say, if it was made by a multinational corporation, I'd prefer to die? No, you say, okay, well, the doctor told me I have to take this pill. I'll take the pill. We rely on the authority of the doctor, and we don't care whether the technology came from large corporation, small corporation. We don't worry about bioproperty. Indeed, the same thing's true with computers. I hate Microsoft. I simply defer to no one in my hatred of Microsoft. Please don't record that anywhere. I probably won't survive getting out of Corvallis. But I do recognize that even though it's a multinational firm, and it clearly has its tentacles into my pocketbook, because every time I want to change things, they charge me money and so on, I also recognize that the technology works. And the technology is better than pen and pencil. So it doesn't really matter to my utility the fact that they charge me money. And that's true, Sony puts digital rights control on music until recently. We have lots and lots of huge corporations claiming property in things that we'd prefer they didn't, but we put up with it. Okay. Not with agricultural biotechnology. The opposition has targeted agricultural biotechnology as a sphere in which property is unacceptable. So the 1998 is the period of the EU U-turn, but only agricultural crops. The Cartagena Protocol globalizes the EU frame. I don't have time to talk about this, but the EU pushed for, and social movements globally pushed for, a protocol on the Convention on Biological Diversity, a protocol regulating biosafety. The European view of this was successful. The United States refused to join in and opposed it, as did Argentina and a number of other countries, because they were large producers of transgenic agricultural crops. The Cartagena Protocol then made global the European framing of GMOs, meaning not recombinant DNA in other fields, but only in agriculture, and framed them as needing surveillance, licensing, regulation, monitoring, and so on. Framed them as potentially risky. Okay. So what I want to argue here is that neither Luddism nor anarcho-science really matters. It's utility. And this is the support in Europe for these kinds of technologies, including biofarming. In 6 out of 10 countries where a recent Eurobarometer study was done, 6 out of 10 countries people supported biofarming, that is making pharmaceutical inputs from plants that are genetically engineered. There's strong public support in the EU for nanotechnology, pharmacogenetics, gene therapy. Interestingly enough, Europeans show by a pretty big margin willingness to pay more for genetically engineered plastics, for example, that are recyclable. So in other words, if you can make progress through genetic engineering that will allow you to reduce environmental damage, Europeans are even willing to pay for it. So this is, I just want to give you one example of the many. This is optimism about new technologies. Do you think each of the following technologies will improve our way of life? Notice there's not a lot of difference here. In biotechnology, it's 75, 78, 75. Very close. The exception, of course, is food. So the Europeans find no consumer advantage in food. They're not interested in eating transgenic food. Nobody has a particular interest in eating transgenic food, but they have, in general, optimism about biotechnology. And so this is the way, I know, I hate these things too, especially late in the lecture. And it kind of pops up and I say, oh no, I have to explain this. Well, okay, so what I did, I just did a little chart to help us understand this interaction between ideas and interest in terms of where social protest goes. Okay? So note this, if we look at recombinant DNA technology, we have this fundamental split into pharmaceutical and food. Just to give an example. So pharmaceuticals, there's no protest. Metropolitan middle class interest or utility, very high. I mean, if your doctor says you need this pharma, you take it, right? the known risk is very high for pharmaceuticals. We have a horrific record of pharmaceuticals gone bad, Vioxx being the most recent. Or maybe it's not the most recent, but it's the most horrific I know about. And multinational dominance is also very high. Food, on the other hand, we have no interest, that is material interest in the technology in the metropolitan middle class. So we have no interest. The protest mobilization, though, is here and not here where people do have an interest. You see, there's a kind of a perfect inverse relationship between interest and a protest activity. Now, just for fun, I said, what if we called all of the electronic gadgets that we have electron manipulation technology as opposed to GMOs? We have EMTs. So we have these EMTs, and we would probably want to disaggregate them, right? Wouldn't you want to disaggregate? Say, well, okay, well, there are computers and softwares, there's cell phones. Those are two possible disaggregations. And there's no protest against cell phones and so on. There's high, very high utility to both of these technologies. Known risk. Now note over here, I put none with a question mark. From the very beginning of the cell phone, there were a lot of kind of creepy scientific findings about cell phones. A recent study from the University of Pittsburgh's Oncology Institute suggests that there are very real risks, especially for young people with cell phones. So it's not true that we have no risk with cell phones. In fact, what some of the science is telling us is that the risk may be very high, but we don't know for sure because these tests take a long time to develop. It's hard to know what the science will say. But notice that nobody throws away a cell phone because there's a risk. Any of you throw away your cell phone just because you might have a risk of brain tumors and such things? Okay, so the point here is about the strength of utility in overcoming risk. And risk is something, if you have surgery, you accept the risk because it might be worse not to have surgery. If you don't have a cell phone, you accept the disutility of not having a cell phone. So we're constantly making these trade-offs, and the place where these trade-offs are most anomalous is with regard to GMOs. So this is our puzzle in more graphic form. Why is Code Pink, feminist peace organization, with whom I usually agree about things, why is Code Pink saying no to GMOs? And the answer, I think, has to do with information flows, authoritative knowledge through coalitions. Okay, so global coalitions rely on local confirmation. Mark Twain said this first. I love this. Rumor can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And within these networks, these global networks, we have a kind of reciprocal diffusion of authoritative narratives. That again sounded like this article that Steve was quoting from. But it makes sense, right? It's reciprocal. Within networks, there's information flowing in both directions. And it's authoritative because people in the network have reasons to believe the authenticity of other people within the network. So we get from north to south, we get flows of fish germs and strawberries, terminator genes, patents. From south to north, we get farmer suicides, dead sheep in Andhra Pradesh, South India. Here's my little picture of BT cotton in this context, what it looks like. Okay, so we start with Canadian website, truth claims flow to affiliated NGO networks in India. This is terminator gene and MNC patents. This goes to what I call epistemic brokers. Steve told me this was a very bad term to use unless I explain it. By epistemic brokers, we mean people who vet knowledge, right? And the sense in which these are brokers is that they are taking knowledge from a global system and translating it into knowledge that can be used by these local networks for opposing transgenics. And indeed, nobody in local networks would know much about Monsanto's terminator gene or MNC patents without these epistemic brokers. They have several characteristics. They're much more highly educated than the people in the lower trenches of these epistemic communities. Much more highly educated. They have global reach. They have global skills. They have cell phones. They are on the network all the time. They travel internationally. So they are brokers who have legitimacy from their involvement in the broader world. They come back from London. They come back from Paris. Their stuff is on NPR. It's on Pacifica Network. So they have that kind of cachet of being globally knowledgeable. And they, therefore, carry this kind of knowledge to these local level organizations. This one is Vandana Shiva's, Navdanya, 9 seeds. Then this moves into local projects of NGOs. there's money involved, there are jobs involved, people have to run projects, people get jobs in rural areas where there are very few jobs otherwise. The epistemic brokers, in turn, get information locally that feeds back into truth claims that eventually get to the transnational network. And these are, in India's case, BT cotton disasters. I read you Vandana Shiva's take on BT cotton. It's destroyed agriculture, it's destroyed farmers, and so on. So this is the story that goes back to the network. And the dead sheep are kind of interesting. I don't even want to go into this, but there's no way the Cry-1AC can kill a sheep. There are a lot of other things that can kill sheep, but we've had these persistent stories of 1,600 sheep die here, 1,800 sheep die there. I went to Warangal to check out the dead sheep stories. There is absolutely not a shred of evidence that any sheep, not one, much less 1,600, ever died from consuming a BT cotton leaf. But these stories become instantiated in transnational advocacy networks, and you will read them on the web. Google sometime dead sheep in Warangal or dead sheep in Adilabad, and you'll find these stories popping up, and they're vetted by the Independent Science Panel in London, they're vetted by the Soil Association of Great Britain, they're vetted by other brokers in the system. Now what's interesting about this kind of network is that the credibility of the epistemic brokers is based on their indigeneity. These are local people with local contacts. They speak local language. They sometimes have interesting outfits, right? In a way that their legitimacy depends on being able to look both ways. They are Janus-faced, right? They have the skills and the knowledge to be able to deal with the global networks. They have the local presence to be able to deal with local people, and therefore they become credible brokers of information. Epistemic just means that which is true. So this is my take on how this happens, and you notice, of course, Prince Charles ends up at the center. How else could he blame GM crops for farmer suicides? The great puzzle to me has always been, why would farmers all over India not only adopt, but adopt in greater numbers every year crops that are destroying them? Why would they continue to adopt crops that kill their sheep and destroy their agriculture on their farm? The adoption curve in India is even steeper than the international adoption curve. Why would that happen if this was a disastrous technology? And the answer from epistemic brokers is the enormous power of multinationals to fool the peasants. Right? So peasants are constructed as kind of passive victims without agency. My experience in India is precisely the opposite. Right? That the NGO epistemic brokers don't have a lot of agency. They're simply transmitting information in both directions that's consonant with a master narrative, whereas farmers are constantly searching out new technologies, they're constantly trying new crops, and they have a fantastic history of confronting some of the most difficult issues imaginable, and the resilience and the agency that they've shown is truly remarkable. And just a personal note, I find it kind of insulting that their agency is so belittled by people who say, these farmers are so dumb, you can tell them this seed's good for you, it's killing off your sheep, it's killing off your crop, it's putting you in debt, it's destroying your farm economy, and yet you'll grow it again next year, tell your neighbor to grow it again, and everybody keeps growing it the next year. It's a little bit insulting, frankly. So, okay, here is one of these projects. This is a GMO-free zone. I just want to point out, this is one I visited. It's kind of a Potemkin village. Hardly anybody lives there. The money comes from Europe. And note the implementing agency is a local organization that gives jobs to local guys. This is a sub-village called Jangao. And then we have the international NGOs. We have AEI Luxembourg, and then a more local Center for Sustainable Agriculture, Secunderabad, which is about 2 hours away, HIVOS, which is in the Netherlands, very large funder of this kind of protest globally, HIVOS. Okay. Here are the dead sheep protests in India. This makes for great dramaturgy. If you think Monsanto's propaganda campaigns are crude, check out this. Okay. Puzzle. I'm just reframing my argument and we'll finish. Why has the GMO frame proved persuasive and powerful? Strategically successful lumping and splitting off those technologies of high utility in industry, pharmaceuticals, medicine, splitting off those from the GMO frame because it is not possible to mobilize against utility. People don't mobilize against their self-interest or against their doctors, typically. And then lumping together all the traits, all the cultivars, all of the agricultural systems, lumping together all of these other cultivars and calling them GMOs, regardless of what trait it is. How the trait got into the cultivar becomes the only meaningful variable. Even though we know, ask about any cultivar, you may want to know a lot of other things about it, not how the trait got into the plant. Indeed, many traits can be gotten into plants through various technologies, one of which is transgenic. Okay. The conjunctures and path dependency. Again, this is social science talk. Conjuncture is a coming together of a particular set of forces at a particular time, and then the path dependency that follows from that. Once on a certain path, it's reinforced. Okay? And the path dependency here is the decline of faith and science in government in the EU. Mad cow disease, tremendous blow to faith in government and science. Especially government science. Remember the Minister of Agriculture of Great Britain feeding his 3-year-old daughter a hamburger, saying, if there were any danger of mad cow disease, would I be feeding my daughter this hamburger? And of course there was danger, and he was a government minister saying there was none. The government was covering up, and they knew that they were covering up. So there was a tremendous fall in faith in government and science in the EU. And this effective mobilization against GM food, too much time to take, but it's an interesting story how GM food was targeted, protested, and effectively became one of the symbols of the unnatural and the unacceptable. And then this EU U-turn on GMOs, segmented global market, restructured the interest of all the poor countries and all the poor farmers. It became more risky to have a biotech industry, more risky to have a biotech sector, more risky to grow biotech crops. This is much of what Parlberg points out for Africa. If you're going to export to Europe, you have to take special caution to avoid biotechnology. And so the successful framing restructured the interest in the global economy through trade. So are there alternative frames? I mean, if we framed all these rDNA things in agriculture as GMOs, and we frame them as risky and perhaps unacceptable on other grounds like multinationals, are there alternative compatibilities? And I just want to suggest a few because I think this is what's going to happen. I think that this reframing is taking place. First of all, you know, we have the US FDA. All of you had transgenic stuff for breakfast, probably. Certainly I did. I'm a member of an organic co-op, and they can't guarantee that there isn't gene flow in the stuff that I get from the organic co-op. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Substantial equivalence. You could ask the question, take a fine mesh and say, is there any variation between the average for crop A that's transgenic, crop B of the same thing that's not transgenic? Let's see if we can find any difference. And the US FDA can't find any difference. So they say substantial equivalence because by admittedly crude measurements, they're not finding any difference. Now, Don Rumsfeld told us that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence or something like that, but in his case, he got it all screwed up and there was nothing there to have evidence of. So anyway, but you know, just a little bit of epistemological caveat here about Rumsfeldian logic. So we could think of a substantial equivalence sort of argument. Can we find any difference between transgenic corn and non-transgenic corn in any kind of meaningful way? Is the variance within non-transgenic corn of a particular cultivar greater or less than the variation within a transgenic cultivar? If not, we've got substantial equivalence. Okay? Secondly is a developmental toolkit. Major international organizations, including the World Bank, SIGIAR, the UNDP, WHO, FAO, all of these organizations have published reports saying that transgenics can be a powerful weapon in the battle against poverty in poor countries and for agricultural development. So one way to frame rDNA technology is as part of a toolkit. You may want to use it for cotton because pesticides are so deadly in cotton farming. You may not be particularly interested in using it in some other cultivar, some other kind of crop. So they become part of a toolkit that you may or may not apply as necessary. Organic, Deperna Roy has a wonderful paper called To BT or Not to BT in which she interviews organic farmers in Gujarat, Majority of them use Bt cotton. In this country, people would say, but this is a complete opposition. If it's organic, it can't be Bt. If it's Bt, it can't be organic, and so on. The farmers say, why not? They have no reason to exclude Bt cotton from their organic agriculture. Reason being, they're not applying synthetic chemicals that kill other things in the soil or cause environmental externalities. All of the insecticidal protein is inside the plant. So the farmers say, very much like the woman that I first showed you, it's on the head of the bollworm, not on the head of the farmer. And finally, sustainability. You know, this is one of the most interesting things. The Pesticide Action Network has done a great job of globally advertising the unsustainability of using pesticides in agriculture, especially in poor countries where nobody has protective gear. People work often half naked, their bodies are sweaty. People have horrific responses to pesticides in poor countries. This has been documented very well by the WHO and by a number of academic studies. The Pesticide Action Network says we've got to stop this. We've got to get off the pesticide treadmill. So Bt plants come along, and Bt plants say, the developers of the plants say, we can reduce pesticide use by putting the insecticidal protein inside the tissue of the plant where it never gets to the human beings, it doesn't get to the water system, and it doesn't get to the soil. Wouldn't that be a good idea? And the Pesticide Action Network rejected it for two reasons. First of all, it is a GMO. Right? The way that trait got into the plant is more important than the effect of the trait on the agroeconomic system. Okay? And secondly, the coalitions of which the Pesticide Action Network is a part had themselves rejected GMOs. So transgenics became an unacceptable technology on grounds of sustainability, whereas in fact they might be one of the better ones. And what I suggest then is that we think about sustainability, we think about traits. What traits do we want in plants? Moisture stress resistance might be a good trait to have in plants with global warming. So we think about the trait, not how the trait gets into the plant. There are many ways to get traits into plants, some of which are quite brutal. We think about Gregor Mendel kind of tending his peas as a way of plant breeding. That's not the way it works. Plant breeding is an often very intrusive, invasive, and quite dramatic process of shaking up genomes and putting them into new pieces, mutagenesis by chemicals and radiation and so on. So there are many ways of breeding that get to traits, and the question is, what is the trait, not how did the trait get there? Okay? Conclusions. Okay. Nature produces both monsters and miracles. I think it's pretty clear that nature... Yeah. Okay. Secondly, God's plans are difficult to discern. I really worry about kind of crossing swords with Prince Charles because he was appointed by God, so he probably knows more about this stuff. You know, I mean, I was appointed by a dean, and he's retired. So Prince Charles may have the edge on me when it comes to discerning God's will. And I think it's important here, if you're interested, to read the Nuffield Council's Alternative Ethics. Nuffield Council says, we as human beings who are privileged, that is those of us with good brains, living in rich places with lots of alternatives, we have a moral obligation to use whatever technology would work to help people who are less fortunate than we are. It's a kind of Kantian or golden rule notion of how our obligations fall on us as people who are relatively privileged. So the Nuffield Council has a totally different ethics, and says the ethical solution is to deploy these technologies as soon as we know they will help and as soon as we know they're safe. And then finally, the rDNA techniques came without 10 commandments. The laws are going to have to be ours, and democracy has a lot of trouble with science, right? I mean, there's a great book, Chris Mooney, Republican War on Science. It's not just Republicans. People like to fiddle with authoritative knowledge because it serves partisan interest. Barack Obama says he's bringing back science to its rightful place in our polity. We'll see, but it's a start. He believes that we need to put science back in control over partisanship, the way it has been with global warming. We'll see. And then finally, I guess what's theology got to do with it? Even princes have interest. Prince Charles announced in 2008, August, that the Dutchy Originals line of organic products was going to launch the brand in India and in the US, part of a 5-year strategy to quadruple their annual turnover. The construction of an opposition, a kind of a dialectical opposition between the organic and the transgenic, opens the field for a market niche for people who produce organic or GMO-free. And Prince Charles is part of that coalition. So as I said, even princes have interests, whatever their theology. Thank you.